Okay, thank you very much, and well, thank you to Sean and the University of Florida for inviting me to this workshop. So I'm going to talk about, the title of the talk is Smart Planning of Energy Systems Under Uncertainty. So I'm going to talk more about some general issues of uncertainty in energy systems modelling or modelling in general, how we deal with that, and I'm going to talk specifically about smart grids, but I'll come to some of the rather knotty issues to do with smart grids again. This is work together with Stan Zachary, who's also part of the Great Britain Statutory Adequacy study. Anthony Lawson, PhD student in statistics at Durham, Michael Goldstein, who's the Professor of Bayesian Statistics at Durham, Monju, PhD students in engineering, and then, gender regulator, and Paul Country, who's helped a lot with network planning methods. Just to introduce Durham University a little bit. So Durham University is the third oldest university in England. One unusual feature of the university, because of how we were founded, is that we own a medieval castle. So even if you think my talk is a complete load of rubbish, you should still think about coming to visit us and to see the historic city. Events that we hold each year, we have a risk and reliability modelling of energy systems day in November. We're also, as in the introduction, hosting the International Conference on Probabilistic Methods applied to power systems. Durham Energy Institute coordinates the cross-disciplinary research across Durham University in energy. So this includes collaborations I have with statisticians. We also work a lot with social scientists and economists. One interesting potential collaboration we have is with a group called in philosophy called the Centre for Humanities Engaged in Science and Society, who work on the use of science modelling in public industrial policy. It's rather fascinating. They're a very, very practically minded, interesting group of people, and I never really imagined that we'd be thinking about this exciting possible collaboration with philosophers. So, uncertainty in modelling. I'll just start off with a few well-known quotations about modelling. There's the famous quote from George Box that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I mean, I'd say that actually simply getting at the fact that the model and the real world are not the same thing. Someone who many of you in the room will know, Ben Hobbs, he often talks about using simple models for insights and complex models for quantifications. One of the trend at the moment is to use very complex computer models in system planning. It's often difficult to, you get a number out, but it's often very difficult to identify why you got that particular number as opposed to what are the inputs or bond structures driving it. Another very useful quote is, don't be proud of this technological tower you've constructed. I want to take this. It's important when doing modelling just to take a realistic view of what your model actually can and cannot say. And you'll put a lot of effort into it, but there will be limitations on what it can say about the real world. And the Grand Moff Tarkin, the commander of the Death Star, didn't take this kind of realistic view of his Death Star, and it didn't have a good outcome for him. What do I mean by uncertainty? Because quite often you see work on talking about uncertainty, which takes quite a narrow view of the modelling uncertainties that are being looked at. So you often get the classification of uncertainties into aleatoric and epistemic, and I actually looked up I always have trouble remembering which way round those are, so I looked up the origins of the word. So aleatoric uncertainty, I can handle the origin of this, but it comes from the Latin for a dice, gambling. I studied Latin at school, but I actually know the Latin word allia from having read all of the Asterix cartoon books.
Finally became useful.
Oh yeah. Yeah, very, very educational. So so alias are concerned things which come out differently each time we run an experiment, even if we knew the system structure and parameters perfectly. So the classic example of this is tossing a coin. Even if you know it's a fair coin, you still don't know whether it's on an individual trial, whether it's going to come up heads or tails. Or in power systems, classic aleatoric uncertainties, which conventional generating units from down any point in time. We have epistemic uncertainties. I didn't study Greek at school, doesn't crop up much in Asterix, so a bit less on slightly shaky ground here. These are uncertainties which can in principle be reduced if we obtain better knowledge. So an example of this in energy systems would be forecasts of underlying energy demand growth. And I mean, sometimes it actually is possible to reduce epistemic uncertainties greatly. An example of that is if you have a coin, you don't know whether it's fair, you can run repeated trials and do some statistics. Sometimes it's not. So for instance, we don't know whether carbon capture and storage will ever work on a commercial scale. Maybe we can become more informed about the issues, but we still, that uncertainty can only be reduced so much. Another example, which I'll just illustrate a little bit, is if data are inevitably very sparse. And when you're dealing with reliability modelling, you're often dealing with rare events, and you inevitably have a limited relevant historic experience. So I'll just give a couple of illustrations of particular technical work from things I've been doing in Durham. Firstly, I'll give an example of assessing statistical relationship between wind and available wind and demand. Came out of the Great Britain Adequacy study, I always seem to end up talking about adequacy somewhere, and I think there are good reasons for that. I mean, one is that it really matters. It's something that utilities really worry about. Another is that it's the actual mathematical modelling, the actual underlying mathematical models that are used in practical adequacy studies are about the simplest mathematical models that anyone uses for anything important in the real world with any real meaning. But there are all kinds of interesting statistical issues involved. And because of the simplicity of the underlying mathematical model, it becomes a very good exemplar for a lot of these statistical issues. And it's one thing that I think is quite surprising is that given all of the work that's been done on generation adequacy assessments over the last few decades, there's been very, very little work done, what I would call statistical work, in the sense of looking at the relationship between modelling results and the real systems that they're supposed to represent. So the classic 1 day in 10 years loss of load expectation target, that's essentially a target in each system that's usually essentially a target within the model that they're building. It's quite unclear what it said, what that target actually means with respect to the real system. So just to illustrate the importance of this, I mean, if you actually have absolute supply shortages, these hit the headlines. There was the incident in Texas in 2011 where cold weather drove a combination of high demand in winter and failure of a large amount of conventional capacity on startup. There's the famous incident in 2000 in California when, this was touched on yesterday, when Enron didn't help matters, but the underlying issue was a lack of generation investment, which allowed Enron to make things worse. And this illustrates California illustrates why politicians really care about generation adequacy, because the California power crisis contributed to general sense of malaise, which led to Gray Davis's recall election being replaced by Arnold Schwarzenegger. So politicians really care about this stuff because governments can fall if you run into adequacy trouble in the system. In terms of how this hit the headlines in Britain, in autumn 2012, I went home from work one day and sat down on the settee and put the BBC 6 o'clock news on and found out this project that I'd been involved in was the lead item, which was not the usual business of academic research in fairly nerdy areas of power systems analysis, which I spend a lot of the time doing. And we went one better this year. We had a very fair report of this in The Sun, which is Britain's biggest selling tabloid newspaper. Just look at briefly at the underlying mathematical model talking about. So, looking at calculating the classic indices like loss of load expectation, we could regard this as looking at a snapshot margin of available generating capacity over demand. So if we define X available existing capacity, conventional capacity, Y available additional capacity, in our case wind, then D demand. We're interested in indices like probability that the margin Z is less than 0. And this gives us, looking at this snapshot picture, gives us a unified framework that also is relevant for whole season indices like loss of load expectation. So if you take these variables X, Y, and D to randomly chosen points in time, loss of load expectation, the sum over periods in the future season you're studying of the loss of load probabilities is just the number of periods times this snapshot LOLP is a randomly chosen point in time. And this snapshot picture is much more convenient if you're going to do any trying to do any pen and paper theory because you don't have time anywhere. It's also common to define capacity value metrics which quantify the contribution of the additional generation within the particular risk calculation. Indices that people use, so I've defined these with respect to loss of load probability as the risk index. We might look at effective load carrying capability, so I've got the baseline risk level here at M, the margin of available existing capacity over demand. So we ask if we bring in the additional capacity to wind, how much additional demand can we add in while maintaining the same risk level? We might look at equivalent firm capacity, where your baseline risk level is loss of load probability, including the additional generation. You ask the question, if you replace the additional generation with a completely reliable block of capacity, what size of block of capacity will get back to the same risk level. To give some typical results, the results I'll show are based on a slightly fiddled around with version of the data used in the statutory capacity assessment study. So this is generally representative of what results look like in Great Britain, but isn't anyone's central view in a particular Great Britain scenario. In here I've done a calculation assuming statistical independence between demand and available wind. Come back later to whether that's a reasonable assumption. So if you add in more wind capacity, then the upper which way around is it? The upper set of curves with the circle. This is the loss of load expectation at risk level. It's inevitable. If you add in more wind capacity, you add in more resource, risk level has to go down. I've also put in this confidence interval, which arises, this expresses the sampling uncertainty arising from the fact that we've got a finite demand history. Very little additional sampling uncertainty arising from the wind when we assume independence. This is the equivalent firm capacity, so one of the metrics of the capacity value of the wind. Again, this shows a very similar pattern to what you see in calculations from any system, that as you increase the installed wind capacity, equivalent firm capacity as a percentage of installed decreases. That's about the fact that when you get to very large installed wind capacities, the possibility of having near zero available wind across the whole system comes to dominate wind's contribution. Okay, so question of wind demand independence, which is, it's not naturally an obviously good assumption at all, because whether you're in a summer or winter peaking system, the last little bit of peak demands is typically driven by the weather, by temperature. And obviously available wind capacity or available solar capacity is also driven by the weather. So it's natural to think that the very highest demands might be associated with particular weather systems, with particular renewable resource conditions. If we look at the evidence we have in this in Britain, I've just put up a simple scatter plot of the 7 years of demand and wind resource data. Horizontal axis is demand divided by average cold spell peak. So average cold spell peak is a measure of underlying peak demand level that we use in Britain. It's independent of the weather conditions that occur in a particular winter. Basically, it's the given underlying demand patterns. It's the demand you would get on a December weekday at time of daily peak if national grids main demand forecasting temperature variable was 0 Celsius. And you find that at any demand level, you can have any wind load factor across the system. I've also put in essentially a smooth moving average using an appropriate statistical formula. And you find that across, within this data set, across the sort of typical winter demand levels, you get a load factor of, mean load factor of about 40%. This seems to drop off, but we've actually got very, very little data here. Within this 7-year data set from 05 to 2012, all of these, I think all but 1 or 2 of these days when average cold spell peak was exceeded come from just 3 distinct periods in winters 08 to 11. And you can't really argue that gives more than one entirely independent data point because of the way that extreme winters tend to cluster. Now, actually, even if you add in more data going further back, if you're looking at meter demand data, you would have to, even if you went back to 1990, you only actually pick up one further cluster of equivalently severe winters. So no real possibility of getting more directly relevant data from metering. So we tend to have a lot of uncertainty over what this relationship should be. So in terms of the nature of the uncertainties we have in the problem, so given all the probability distributions, the outturn hours of trial is uncertain. These metrics like loss of load expectation, equivalent firm capacities, these are actually deterministic functions of data in the sense that if I give you the probability distributions, we can these model outputs are fixed. So we have uncertainty, and it's this quite often it's this when considering uncertainty, people a lot of studies get to this point and then stop. We also, because we've got very limited directly relevant data, even if we make some wrong assumption of a stationary climate, then we've got very considerable uncertainty over what this wind demand relationship is. So we've got uncertainty over what level of uncertainty we have. We've got uncertainty over what the probability distribution should be. And of course, reasonable people might differ on their quantification of their uncertainty and what these probability distributions look like. So this takes us to this kind of further level of having uncertainty in the uncertainty in the uncertainty. We also, of course, have uncertainty in the relationship between model structure and the real system. Michael Goldstein has some very clever ways of dealing with this systematically, which I don't really understand at all. That's something that I want to explore down the track. Of course, I got in quite a lot of trouble with Michael when I showed him this slide, because he's a subjective Bayesian, so if we're looking at the risk of shortfall in the future, he would simply say we have uncertainty, and he doesn't really care which of these, doesn't really care whether it arises from whether it's the simple the uncertainty in outcomes given the data, or whether it's the uncertainty in what the data looks like. So the approach we came up with, really rather Stan Zachary came up with for the statutory study, was to rescale the distribution of available wind at the very highest demands by a scaling function that depends on the demand level. And the key thing there is that really the key thing there is we just don't know what the relationship really looks like, is that it allows us to do some sensitivity analysis. So we and then put bounds on what model outputs might be. So we have two versions of the calculation here, looking at equivalent firm capacity, one of which, this is what we had before, assuming independence between demand and available wind. This one is a very pessimistic view of how bad wind resource might be at times of highest demand. And this actually turned out to be all we really needed for in the statutory study, because if you take a sort of central view between this, then out at even at 30 gigawatts of available wind capacity, you've got the uncertainty of about plus or minus 1.5% of installed wind capacity in the equivalent firm capacity. So that's a few hundred megawatts. When you're doing all these calculations, a few hundred megawatts is nothing. It's an uncertainty compared to, you think about the uncertainty over which conventional units are going to be installed on the system, and there you're dealing in the gigawatts. So we actually came to the conclusion that without actually really needing to have data to do proper estimation, we're able to come to the conclusion by this sensitivity analysis that we don't really, for this purpose. I mean, it's an interesting statistical modelling exercise in its own right, but for actually doing practical calculations, we don't have to worry too much about the detail of this relationship. How to do statistical modelling without data. Okay, network planning. Caveat on this. Well, we had a caveat yesterday of preliminary results. I don't know whether it's an advantage or a disadvantage that I actually did work out at 8:25 yesterday morning exactly what the problem was with results that I didn't. So this section is actually rather shorter than I thought it would be when I proposed the title of the talk. But I'll really just illustrate some of the statistical methods that Michael and other people have developed for looking at uncertainty in complex models. So the problem we're looking at here is network planning. So main driver of transmission reinforcements in Britain at the moment is integrating, taking up the energy capacity, the energy output of remote wind generation. A lot of wind generation is, particularly onshore, is being built in Scotland. just as an aside, this means that the finite network capacity makes very little contribution to adequacy risk. Because if you've got enough, when you've got a lot of remote wind generation, if you've got enough, if constraints are biting, that means there's a lot of generation available somewhere. This is based essentially on the replicates of national grids network planning and modelling. The question is, how do we take decisions under uncertainty in just about all model inputs in the future system background? We've got very, very high dimensional uncertainties here. And I mean, these uncertainties are in inputs are large. Major upgrades, well, they actually take say 5 years to plan and build in engineering terms, probably 10, maybe 10 to 15 by the time you've been through the planning and political process. And they have 40+ year lifetime. I don't know what system's going to look like there. Big challenge here is that you can't evaluate full computer models like this for all choices of input parameters which we would wish to do a full sensitivity analysis. So the approach taken is to use a statistical emulator to encode, well, I've said here encode the uncertainty in the relationship between in the model output for any input. You could also take this a step further and have an emulator which encodes uncertainty in the relationship between the model inputs and output with respect to the real system. So the mean of the emulator would be essentially an interpolator, that is an interpolator, the central estimate output for points where you haven't evaluated the full model. Variance will gives you the uncertainty in the model output for a given input. Covariance between different inputs tell you how you should update. If you do a model run with this piece of input data, it tells you how you should update your uncertainty in the model output for all other possible inputs. So we've been looking at a demonstration involving uncertainty in 3 or 4 input variables. So we'll be looking at uncertainty in demand growth and uncertainty in sort of conventional plant availabilities. To get good coverage of the decision space, we will use a Latin hypercube to pick which points we're going to evaluate the full model at. So the idea is that you've got this emulator which that you can evaluate very quickly, which represents the which represents the uncertainty in the model outputs. And then if we have some utility function which represents the decision maker's attitudes to risk, combine our uncertainty in inputs with the statistical emulator to give our overall uncertainty in outturn, and then we could use that fast evaluation emulator in the decision process. One issue here is that if you have a large decision space, you may not be able to do enough full model runs to narrow search space down very much in one go. So one approach to this is that we'd have so-called waves of emulation, where you can, in the first go, you cover the whole decision space and strip out really bad choices. Then in the second wave, you build an emulator on a finer grid over a smaller remaining decision space. One issue you can run into there is that sometimes on a wave of emulation, you end up retaining certain possible decisions because they might be good decisions. So sometimes you end up retaining certain decisions because you just have a lot of uncertainty in what model outputs look like. So you then might have some kind of strange disconnected search space on the second wave, which looks something like this, and you might then build 4 different emulators covering different reasonably coherent bits of the search space. It obviously wouldn't make sense to build a single emulator to cover this connected space. As I say, unfortunately, this project has been a bit like trying to squeeze a balloon into a box that's not quite big enough. Every time we think we've got it cracked, we've got the paper ready to hit the button and send it to IEEE transactions, and we realise another thing that we need to sort out. So anyway, so I can't present results that were as complete as I was hoping. In terms of future plans, other things we're planning to look at. I've got a postdoc starting in about 6 weeks. Comes from a very interesting background. She did a PhD, just completing a PhD, looking at evidence for traces of cocaine on banknotes. So she's got quite a nice background in some really serious statistical modelling combined with dealing with, in this case, lawyers, and presenting evidence in court who are not with a political sciences background. One very important application of computer modelling in energy policy recently has been looking at generation investments and looking at different market designs as part of the electricity market reform process. So we will eventually this resulted in the introduction of a capacity mechanism, but and then modelling was used to understand the consequences of different market designs. So you have some broad structure of the model saying that each company maximises its profit from the different markets it can play in, subject to whatever market rules are in force. I'm not sure the extent to which this class of models is used in other countries. One particular reason why this is being used so much in Britain is that government policies now are supposed to come with so-called impact assessments, which very often means a large-scale modelling study looking at consequences. I mean, as usual, we have these questions of what do these models say about real power systems as opposed to about models. We have all kinds of uncertainties in future system background which are very difficult to quantify. We also have particular issues here that how do, particularly knotty issue in drawing conclusions about the real world is how well can you represent market real generating companies' decision-making processes within this kind of, inevitably fairly simple mathematical structures. Going to even more challenging problems, we have people use computer models to look at the possible evolution of the entire energy economy, whether within the UK or on a broader scale. So, again, these models, they typically do something like maximise social net present value of social welfare, subject to constraints representing all possible transactions between sectors, input data including development of reduction of costs of different technologies and so on. These are typically end up being deterministic optimization problems or use a pretty brutally reduced scenario tree representing uncertainty in maybe one aspect of system background. Again, these are highly influential in UK policy, but again, there are interesting questions about model real world relationship here. Finally, thinking about smart planning of, or particularly planning for smart grids. So this is one cartoons of what a smart grid might look like, because it might look like something different. When we're dealing with planning assets now, which might be installed, might be commissioned in 2020, they're still going to be around well after 2050. And one big challenge is, in a systematic way, taking planning decisions now which hedge well against all the different ways that technology might develop, and not implicitly taking us, not implicitly committing us unduly to any one particular long-term evolution of systems. There are a lot of difficult, in terms of treating uncertainty systematically, there are a lot of very difficult uncertainties here, like need really to consider the possibility of technologies that we just haven't even thought about yet. It's a very, very difficult thing to do within any mathematical framework. It's the reality of the planning situation we find ourselves in. Finally, just to conclude, the central message I would say is that if there is uncertainty in background against one which is planning, it's a good idea to account for it in any analysis that you're doing, because if you do, then you'll end up taking better decisions. And considering uncertainty in, say, just one aspect of system background, which is quite commonly seen, might not say too much about the real system if there is uncertainty in everything else in the system background. So in terms of future work we have, one interesting point is that evolution, how the structure of how uncertainty evolves over time. So questions like if demand is, if underlying demand growth is high, one point in the future, does that mean that it will continue to be above central projections going further into the future? All these issues about uncertainty and technology growth. One particular interest is questions like linked models of transmission and distribution networks, where you have propagation of uncertainties as models talk to other models, and then there are these issues of models of the whole energy economy, where you're getting massively high dimensional input spaces and with huge uncertainties in absolutely everything there. Okay, so thank you very much. Questions?
I have kind of more an observation, maybe a question will come out of it. It's a theme I've heard in others, and kind of what you're talking about is it's so much of the human part that is being injected into what we're doing in these organized markets. That, you know, dealing with probability and uncertainty when all you were dealing with maybe you had much data on equipment failures and things that lead to it, and weather uncertainties, things that probabilistically maybe you had some hope of predicting. And so much of the theme is, well, guess what? Now you have individuals that are in the decision making, both in the auction process, which things that we've read and we've talked about. One element is we think that these people participating in the auction process are actually intelligent, know what they're doing participating. And I can assure you they don't, because there's things that I participate in, I really don't know what I'm doing when I'm submitting things. It's more random is the point. And I think even if there's solutions on your in your smart grid, we talk about automobiles being used for regulation. You know, it seems you have a factor here, well, maybe the people with the automobiles just get kind of tired of plugging the car in at night. I mean, there seems so much more uncertainty that you're going to have to deal with, and it's a human element, and I kind of don't even know where you start with that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. I mean, it's certainly the case there are some aspects of this that just simply more naturally susceptible to mathematical quantification. So I mean, the example I have, which isn't naturally susceptible to mathematical quantification at all, is how generating companies take investment decisions.
Right.
Because that's a lot about the individual. A lot of that's about the individual company board's attitude to risk, which might not be expressed as a firstly, their attitude to risk might not be easy to second guess. The other thing is how does one assess their that company's own quantification of system background uncertainty. So it's an important point when doing this modelling, but a lot of it I think is simply recognising the realities of the situation, how that relates to the modelling.
Without some kind of modeling, we can't do anything, right? And how else are we going to model uncertainty except by probability distribution?
I think this is it. The thing one has to avoid is that it's quite. I think one sort of easy temptation is to think that that if we have a mathematical model that we can study, then we must be taking better decisions than if we didn't have that. But that's not necessarily the case. That if your model doesn't represent the real system sufficiently well, you might be taking one extreme end. You might end up taking completely arbitrary decisions without actually realising that they're arbitrary, actually thinking they're very systematic.
I think that the point Ian made and you made is that we can make the system more predictable by design. So I mean, like project servers instead of actual, people thinking completely unpredictable bids every moment. And by design, you can make the system more predictable. So and definitely getting humans out of the loop is one way to make the statistician's job easier.
Yeah, it's also certainly important to distinguish between the kind of uncertainty issues you have on an operating time scale and on a planning time scale. Because the operating time scale problems are much more tractable.
Well, I was just going to argue with the tractability of the operating time scale. In that, if humans are in the loop, their behaviour is not a stationary process. So, a weather-related phenomena, for example, the first day I put up with, the second day I put up with it, the third day that was in Australia, I pull their heating equipment out of the cupboard that they put away 12 months earlier.
Yeah. I suppose there I could be talking about like how mathematicians think of different sizes of infinity. You could have you might have an intractable operating problem, but then you have the planning problem is in a sort of further class of sort of intractability. So I'm really talking sort of relative tractability there rather than saying the ops problem is tractable.
Right.
What sort of a track record do we have with our predictions? Because we always talk about uncertainty, and then we make forecasts, and we say, well, things are uncertain, but we made this forecast. If we look back 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago to energy sort of forecasting policies, or even in the bigger...
Well, we had that in 2008. It was all wrong.
We've seen this. Two examples of this. Over roughly the same period over the last 5-10 years of the in Britain demand growth, because we assume it's just going to keep growing nice and steadily from average cold spell peak of 60 gigawatts, then heading slightly upwards. Then we had the financial crisis, and now it's somewhere down about 55. And then another which has come up quite a bit this week is shale gas. And 10 years ago. That will render any predictions from 10 years ago pretty just wildly different. But again, one thing one often sees in particularly once you get to the sort of higher political level projections, that the idea of point predictions of what will happen, your point predictions of oil prices is just it's just wrong. I mean, the question. I mean, you always have some uncertainty in the projections that you're making, and I think if you start, once you start expressing the combination of maybe a central projection plus uncertainty around it, then you have something where you can much more meaningfully assess.
Well, that would help you with outliers like shale gas, for example.
Yeah, this is what the trouble is. We know, it's one of the great difficulties that we know that somewhere there are so many of these possible outliers out there that it's quite likely that something's going to happen that but we just have no idea of which of this myriad of possibilities it will be. But one trouble with a lot of these, with these very, with assessing the quality of these very long term projections, is that if we're looking at, say, the whole energy economy projections going out to 2050, then we'll be on to completely new classes of analysis, and all of this will already have happened by the time we have the chance to analyse a lot of aspects of quality of projections.
Okay, well, I mean, I think it's not clear why you want to make projections out to 2050.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I think it's, clearly we need to do some planning. Okay. But that's what we've got markets for. Markets are ways of handling future uncertainty. And what you were suggesting about boards is, of course, classic economic theory says the reason why we've got independent private companies competing with one another is because they've got different views about the future, okay, rather than one imposed view of the future. And of course, it's much better if we've got competing views of the future for planning purposes, okay, because that's more likely to be optimal than having one wrong view. But I mean, I think it is interesting to think about this nearer term modelling, because I think the law of large numbers does apply to micro behaviour, and we can model that much better, okay, and we're getting better and better at that. So, well, at least I think we are. One wonders whether there's more that can be done. Once we've got more consumers participating, more bits of DG, actually modelling what's going to happen to how that stock of DG or that stock of consumers are going to respond, that's actually going to get easier, okay, because that is modelable. Whereas the problem at the moment is we've got small numbers of things in particular places, and we don't have the law of large numbers helping us.
Yeah, you've also got small numbers, early adopters.
Yeah.
People are very conscious of the fact being monitored, all of the usual challenges there. But one specific point when we're looking at this modelling going out to 2050, I think that very often people doing this don't give a very complete, sort of rigorous description of what they're claiming.
Well, it's not an economic model, is it? I mean, what happened to energy demand in the UK was very predictable if you factored in the fact that there is a price response to, with high prices, low incomes. That's what econometrics of demand suggests, okay? So it was simply the sort of straight line predictions of National Grid. That wasn't a decent economic model, was it?
I think the straight line prediction, that I think that's one of these classic things where you have this straight line central projection. I'm not sure whether National Grid published any kind of uncertainty fan around that.
I think they do. Yeah.
That's the usual. Again, that's one of these cases where the uncertainty part of it gets forgotten.
But the GDP effect just swamps that, uncertainty about, assume constant GDP growth. I mean, so.
Yeah.
I guess that, I would agree generally when we look at the experience that Illinois had with its option. We implemented the option and the price went up by 27%, and that double-digit increase in electricity prices resulted in an elimination of the option and the institution of a single buyer in the state of Illinois, who, while they run RFPs, the size and the outcomes of that outcome in politics and how effective results on
Was that a poorly designed auction, or was it actually reaching some sort of
The true price.
optimum, right?
It was a perfect option.
Okay.
It was the New Jersey option, it's just the same process transferred to Illinois, because you're bid in both places. Nobody had a question about the actual effectiveness of the outcomes. It was just that they were too large. Now, remember, 97, the act said reduce prices by 20%, freeze them for 10 years, and then have an auction at the end of that to get to a 27% increase in price. But what would the inflation have been over?
Yeah, exactly.
The actual real price increase might have been negative for all I know right now. But the fact that it turned out to be at 27% is all the politicians need to say.
All right. Thank you very much.